Alright, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So my name is Muhammad Ilham Dirwan, and I will be the lead speaker of the presentation tonight. And before going to our core of our presentation tonight, I would like to introduce to our honorable members of Group 5s, which consists of 6 people or 6 students. So the first one on our member, we have Miralda Pranistika, and we also have Yulia Nurul Ismi, and the third one is myself, Muhammad Ilham Dirwan, and the fourth we have Putri Durani, and the fifth we have Lia Kartika, and the last one we have Yusril Samahendra. Okay, so right now jump into the core of our presentation. So the core of our presentation tonight, the topic of our presentation tonight will entitle about language change in social perspective. So the first point of language change in social perspective will be talking about the dialectology and language change in social perspective. So as you can see in here, linguists have long been interested in language change in the 19th centuries. The disciplines of linguistics was understood in a historical sense, and main preoccupations in the field were to study the development of language over time. Since just beginning in the 19th centuries, the historical investigations of dialects have made contributions of both theory and method to the study of language change. So in the next slide, we have isogloss. So the purpose of isogloss is to represent the boundary of any linguistic features or sets of features which separate one speech or variety from another. So most importantly, however, from a theoretical perspective, such research seriously challenged prevailing views of sound change. But ironically, early studies dialect had set out to support the hypothesis that sound change took place according to sound's law that admitted to no exceptions. So as we can see in Germany, for example, the isoglosses run from east to west across Germany, slightly north of Berlin, for example, and Holland. So the feature comprising the isogloss include the pronunciations of final consonants such as P, T, and T, and in words such as Dorf, which mean village in English, and dat, which mean dad in English, and each, which mean I or myself in English. So the first member of each of these pairs in the Low Germanic variants, as found in modern Standard Dutch or German language, and the second is the High German variants as found in modern Standard German language. So the isoglosses for Machens across the Rhine near Benrath, slightly south of the points where the isogloss for each crosses the Rhines at Untergens. The explanation for this kind of internal linguistic variability have appealed to a variety of factors such as markedness and universals, and a number of sociolinguists, for instance, have treated T per Ds as likely more specific versions of more general articulatory reductions rule, because the loss of final consonant is a universal phonetics tendency operative in wide range of language. So by this, it can be assumed that one-to-one relationship between form and meaning is the most natural one. A meaningful feature is more marked if it has no phonetic relation. If language tends to block rule, which will wipe out surface morphological distinctions, that we can predict that a phonological rule of deletions will tend not to operate across morpheme boundaries. So in general terms, we could say that that the grammatical constraints reflects a functional principle, because deletions in this environment would result in syncretism between the present and past tense form, except for the third person singular form. Okay, so that's enough for me, and the next explanation will be continued by the next speaker of our presenter. Here.
Next slide, Ilham. Okay. Okay, now the relationship between variation and change. Um, Constraint hierarchy also can be used to predict the development through time of varieties on the assumption the linguistic change proceed in the stepwise increments with rules generalizing as they spread through time and space as suggested initially. A rule may have a probability of application of 0 in all environment, and then the probability of application increase environment by environment. Um, in assigning the behavior weight to the following consonant and the lighter one to the morpheme boundary, the model predicts that more deletion will occur the monomorphic than bimorphemic clusters. Rules also to operate faster in behavior in lighter environment. Thus, the oldest environment is the earliest and fastest. It becomes categorical at least before the last environment begins to the variable operative. In other words, what is behavior has a greater effect on the application of the rule, and what is quantitatively less is slower and later. Next slide, please. Okay. The spread of linguistic. More generally, the spread of linguistic change behave much like the diffusion of other innovation and even diseases. In fact, the model which biologists use to show how an epidemic spread through a population are relevant to linguistic change. This variable is also sensitive to style, with more deletion in information in age with younger speakers, differing from older speakers with respect to the treatment of verbs such as keep, where past tense is marked both by the final T as well as by vowel change of the type found in strong verbs such as come. There are also differences relating to ethnically and region, with, with African and American, for instance, deleting more frequently than whites. We also saw in chapter 3 that Puerto Ricans who socialize more with African American tended to behave like them linguistically and deleted from final T or D. That's enough for me. The next material will explain by my partner.
Using using represent using represent to explain the past and the past to explain the present. It is now clear that variability is a prerequisite for change. This downward deflection of more standard speech from the normal to casual styles is what we would expect when standard and non-standard speech varieties are in contact. Changes may also enter the standard variety, and when this happens, it is usually from the bottom up, so to speak. They affect casual speech before more formal styles. Just as standard English once diffused out from the London merchant class, now vernacular London speech is spreading to other cities like Norwich, where many young people now say buffer and together instead of bother and together. Cockneys have used these forms for generations. There is evidence that the change from TH to V is spreading by face-to-face contact rather than via the media since areas closer to London have adopted these features more quickly than areas farther away. Though the television program Is Anders has made some features of Cockney accessible to millions. Next slide. Quantitative sociolinguistics. Increased glotalization has also been making headway among middle-class speakers, with the Princess of Wales heard nothing. Glotalization has now been reported from other parts of the English-speaking world, such as New Zealand. These patterns of change have led sociolinguistics to distinguish between change from above and change from below to refer to the differing points of departure to the division of linguistic innovations through the social hierarchy. Through quantitative sociolinguistic work, we now have considerable understanding of how linguistic change might proceed in a functional system by means of internal and external structuring of inherent variability, which shows directional gradients through social groups, geographic space, and time. Research indicates that formal styles and height registers are more conservative, while informal speech grows on the latest innovation. Sometimes items lag behind in certain changes and remain in speech of older people as stylistic variants. New variants often appear first in casual speech, while older ones remain in more emphatic formal styles. Formal styles may provide a locus for the introduction of prestige changes. Faced with seemingly contradictory findings and much ad hoc speculation about the role of women in language change, investigators of language shift have moved on from simplistic correlations between language use and sets to focus on the symbolic and ideological dimensions of language. This allows us to understand how a vernacular language or non-standard speech variety may become linked to a stigmatized ethnic identity, so that a subordinate group may abandon their language in favor of the dominant one, invested with greater symbolic capital. The role played by women or men per se in language shift and change seems therefore to depend very much on the community concerned. In research on Norwegian immigrants in the United States, it turned out to be men who led the community in the acquisition of English, while women lagged behind at first, but seemed to catch up by the second generation. I think that's enough for me.
Change in real versus apparent sign. Age also one of the aspects that contributed in a language change. In a study done of the Gullah Crow spoken in parts of the southeastern United States, older women were the heaviest users of Gullah because they work in domestic and agricultural positions. Older men work mostly in construction. Younger people of both sexes had more access to white-collar jobs and service positions, which brought them into contact with standard English. Younger women were ahead of the younger men in their adoption of a more standard form of English. Similarly, a study of Tunisian women in Morocco showed that older women categorically use diphthongs and AJ, while middle-aged women alternate between diphthongs and monophthongs. Younger women use monophthongs characteristic of male speech. We can see the variation among the middle-aged women as a political identity crisis, reflecting their identities as local, traditional Tunisian women and modern, educated women. Often these conflicting identities are encoded into distinct languages, and code switching function much like style shifting. While some patterns of age grading, i.e. variation in relation to age, might reflect a passing fad such as the Swedish teenagers' use of Nord, or simply be repeated anew in each generation. Other cases may represent change in progress. This can only be determined by comparing the usage of speech communities at 2 points in time. Only then can we tell if contemporary variation, or what we might call change in apparent time, is a stage in long-term change, or change in real time. One of the first demonstrations of age grading in the transmission of change is found in a study done in the Swiss village of Chermy in 1905. The middle-aged generation of speakers fluctuated with respect to the use of both old and new norms, as exemplified in the speech of the older and younger generations respectively. That's all from me. The next material will be explained by the next speaker.
Okay, Ilham, please next slide. Okay, now to examine the diffusion of post-vocalic R, for example, in the United States and Britain, in a historical and geographical perspective. The availability of the dialect atlases and sociolinguistic research on both sides of the Atlantic allows us to make some detailed comparisons of dialect patterns in the two countries. In general, American isoglosses rarely terminate abruptly, which indicates a basic difference between the structure of dialect differentiation in the two countries. Britain, however, the most local dialects were associated with the groups at the lower end of the social hierarchy, while those at the top spoke RP, which show no trace of regionalism. In the eastern United States, three major dialects were identified. It's North, including the New England and the Hudson Valley, Midland include Pennsylvania and the Alleghenies, and South include Chesapeake Bay, Virginia Piedmont, and the Carolinas. It is also possible to trace the transference of patterns from Britain to the United States. Research, however, to demonstrate that most of the dialect differences in the United States had their basis partly in regional varieties of British English, which earlier settler brought with them. In England, for instance, the word brook, burn, and beck show broad regional distribution. Brook is dominant throughout the Midlands and into the south. Beck is found in the area of former Danish settlement, and Burn from Scots extends from Scotland into the border countries in northern England. The term brook was transferred across the ocean. Although it had strong regional ties in England. It was the form accepted in standard. Its rival regional variants were left behind, and two new regional forms developed in the United States, like prawn, found in the Midland dialect, and branch from Southern. The form brook is nocturne. Thus, an item showing a regional pattern in England become narrowly local in the United States. There is linguistic evidence for a historical connection between American speech of the North and West and that of Northern England, and to some extent the South and the pronunciation of Southern England. These linguistic similarities are well supported by the history of American colonization, patterns of westward movement, and later immigration. In Britain, the distribution of post-vocalic R based on dialect research shows that non-rhotic dialects, those without R, were the result of historical innovation which began somewhere
and the east or center of England before spreading northwards. Before Irish immigration to the United States, the population of eastern New England come from the southeastern counties of England, where varieties close to RP are spoken. RP lacks postvocalic R. Western New England, on the other hand, had a large number of Scotch-Irish immigrants, whose dialects has postvocalic R. At the moment, sociolinguistic patterns are wrote guidelines based on generalization from the studies available. Part of the problem in making exploration from these patterns to build a theory is that the relationship between language and social structure may vary considerably, both synchronally and diachronally. That's all from me. The next material will be explained by the next speaker.
Okay, next slide, please. Uh, Language change and social ideology. Due to the social significance of personal reference, pronouns, titles, and other forms of address are particularly susceptible to modification in response to social and ideological change. Such changes may provide important clues to the social class hierarchy and the attachment of social values to linguistic forms. Some of the most important changes affecting English and other European languages since the 1970s have arisen from changes in society's attitudes towards women prompted by political activism. In many countries, the use of non-sexist language is now legally mandated in certain quarters, such as in job advertisement, government publications, and media. As example of the effect of ideology on language change, we can look at some of the European languages other than English which have two forms for the pronoun meaning you. One of the pronouns is reserved for use with persons higher than the speaker in social status or persons with whom the speaker does not have a close personal relationship. In many of these languages, such as French and Swedish, the polite form is actually a plural form, while the intimate form is the singular. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1869, Persian forms of address have undergone change which reflects the shift from power to solidarity. Asymmetrically forms which reflected the complex social structure of revolutionary Iran have declined, and now plain speech and forms of address marking solidarity have become more popular. The terms brother and sister emerged as solitary forms of address after the revolution, just as in the former Soviet Union and China, comrade enjoyed widespread use. Another example of change in address system motivated by changing societal values has been taking place in Nahuatl, spoken in parts of Mexico. Nahuatl has become a language of solidarity in the face of the threat posed by Spanish, which has been replacing Nahuatl for some time. Nahuatl once had an extensive system of honorifics, which affected not only the choice of pronouns, but also the forms of verbs, nouns, and pronouns. In traditional Nahuatl, there were 4 levels as illustrated in the different ways speakers would say give me. Maka is the verb to give. Level 1 is the lowest and would be used for addressing intimates or subordinates. Level 2 for strangers and kinsmen. Level 3 for very old or distinguished people. And level 4 is like level 3, except that it refers to the person addressed in the third person. Meanwhile, the meaning of identity and ethnicity can change according to context, especially in the face of threat from outside. During the Second World War, Sweden adopted the Egalitarian view. In recent years in Britain, we can see the emergence of a more general Asian or even Black ethnicity, which includes both Asian and Blacks. In the eyes of most Britons, South Asians function as a single ethnic or racial. Even though they are very different linguistic, cultural, and religious origins, Thus, the local shop run by a Bengali family might be called by White Britons the Pakistani, Indian, or Asian shop, regardless of the precise national, religious, and ethnic affiliation of its owners. Now, however, the alien environment of Britain seems to be redefining previous outsiders as fellow Asians, and even fellow Blacks due to the similarity in their present circumstances as minority groups in Britain.
Okay, now to jump into the conclusions of our presentation today. So language is essentially a human filters that put cultural product situation in a historical context. The concept of social as well as geographical space are understanding the divisions of chains. Different types of social structures is the rise to different kinds of chains. The most innovative varieties are most likely to be spoken by those with weak network ties, while those with dense multiple networks tend to conserve local varieties. And geographically speaking, centrals are innovative while peripheral areas are conservative. Cities represents a high contrast area where chains are significantly greater for interactions dangerous than in small rural village. Okay. Maybe that's all from us. Thank you very much for watching our presentations. We hope that the points of the explanation can bring understanding into all of us. And so that's all for us today. Let us know if there is any questions regarding to our presentation topic. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.